Welcome to Things I'm Learning About the Cold War, and I want to share with you. So let's jump right into it today. Um, I want to talk a little bit about some information I found about James Forrestal. Um, so, James Forrestal was the Secretary of the Navy during the final year of World War II, and he's the first Secretary of Defense under the National Security Act of 1947. He was an ardent anti-communist, and he died under very suspicious circumstances at the peak of his career and health. The deep state, or people on the government under the government, declared it to be a suicide. His brother Henry felt that he was murdered while in the custody of the government, and literally, um, he had a huge problem with Truman's policies, and was a real there's a real conflict there, and he was he was outspoken criticism of the policies of Truman and dealing with the Cold War, how he was handling the government, and Truman demanded his resignation in March of 1949. So while he was on vacation in Florida, the Surgeon General had him brought back to Washington, admitted to Bethesda Naval Hospital. Nobody understood why the government was involved with the health of a civilian, and if the admission to the hospital was even voluntary. Um, they described that he was suffering from exhaustion and depression due to overwork, and he was placed on the 16th floor. And after several weeks, they kept him. He apparently recovered, but he still kept him in the hospital. And then in May 22nd, he fell to his death from his suite's kitchen window, landing on a ledge of a roof 13 floors below, only clothed in his pajamas with the belt cord of his robe knotted around his neck. And of course, the military board convened and said it was suicide, very tragic suicide. However, if you go to the History News Network, the 60th anniversary of his death, um, the historians were commenting on the Wilcuts report. They were invited to do that. And then Keith Olson, professor emeritus of history at the University of Maryland, told the Life and Times by email. He said that more study was needed, and new evidence in the report suggests that Forrestal was assassinated. Now we know, Russia has had a history of, what is it, defenestration, when you throw somebody out of a window, um, and they've had several key characters in their politics and business die that way, and so there was a lot of strange details about his suicide, a copy a poem from a book, things like that. Just that didn't make much sense to people. Um, so anyway, it's not conclusive that he committed suicide. It's not conclusive that he was murdered. There needs to be more investigation, and that was called for. Don't that will probably be something that will never be solved. But what I wanted to talk about was, that's not what I want to talk about. I just want to lay the groundwork, because I want to start from that point again, and go over the Cold War based on what I'm finding out. So Forrestal, in his diary, which I had to buy it so I could make sure that the quotes that I had read were actually from it. So I got a copy of it from my Kindle, so I could confirm this, because I was reading it in another book, a book by a new journalist, Chesley Manley, about communism in America. So the diaries of Forrestal, Harry Hopkins was FDR's man who would meet with Stalin and communicate with him and make sure he got everything he wanted and even more. And there's been a lot of suspicion about Hopkins just going a little too far, based on his personal beliefs, to help the Soviets. But in any event, Hopkins was at a dinner given by Lord and Lady Halifax at the British Embassy on June 29, 1945. Forrestal wrote in his diary, and I'm going to quote, Hopkins said that he thought the world was now definitely swinging toward the left, that we were in the middle of a revolution, and that it would be unwise to try to oppose it. I replied that it was not inconceivable that the real reactionaries in world politics would be those who now call themselves revolutionaries, because the dynamics of their philosophy all tended toward the concentration of power in the state, with the inevitable result of exploitation of the common man by the masses, or rather by those who in such a system apply power over the masses. And then it goes on to say Hopkins said that England must inevitably go socialist, which it did, and that Churchill did not want the things for England that the labor people wanted: federal housing, slum elimination, ownership of industries, etc. I asked Hopkins how any such country, such as England, could go communistic. I said England had been able to exist and subsist because she was a trading nation, that a capitalistic system was essential to the existence of England. I said that such a nation could only become communistic if we, the United States, underwrote the transaction. Hopkins obviously did not want to pursue this conversation too far because I suspect he did not want to be driven to the position that he was advocating either revolution or communism for this country. But it was pretty clear that he was pro-communist. In April 1952, Colonel Igor Bogolepov, former consular of the Soviet Foreign Office who escaped from Russia and came to the United States after the war, told the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee a remarkable story about Hopkins and the Lend-Lease aid to the Bolsheviks. Bogolepov testified that in July 1941, the Kremlin learned that Roosevelt was sending Hopkins to Moscow for Lend-Lease negotiations with Stalin. Konstantin Umansky, the Soviet ambassador in Washington, was ordered to find out everything he could about Hopkins, especially his attitude toward the Soviet Union, and also to get all possible information about concessions that Roosevelt would demand in return for Lend-Lease assistance. Meanwhile, Stalin appointed a committee headed by V.M. Molotov, the foreign minister, to prepare a list of maximum concessions that could be granted by Moscow in the expected bargaining with Hopkins. Bogolepov was a member of this committee of high-ranking Soviet officials. The Soviet government was prepared, if necessary, to, quote, permit strict American inspection of the use of Lend-Lease materials, admit American military observers into the Soviet lines, grant mining concessions for manganese ore, which the United States imports for a steel industry, invite American capital to participate in the development of Siberia's resources, give a solemn pledge to maintain freedom of speech, freedom of political parties, and freedom of religion. Of course, these pledges would have been worthless after the war, but so long as the Bolsheviks were getting Lend-Lease assistance, the United States could have them to their contract, hold them to their contract. Before Hopkins reached Moscow, however, Molotov briefly told his colleagues that their recommendations would be shelved. He said the Soviet government had learned from a, quote, a certain man at the various highest level of Roosevelt administration that, quote, Mr. Hopkins will demand no concessions whatsoever. His desire is to ask nothing and to give everything, Molotov added. What he wants is to keep us in the fight, and that is all. Mr. Hopkins is completely on our side and may be trusted absolutely. Bogolepov said he was led to believe that Moscow's informant was a spy either in the White House or the State Department, but he did not learn his name. So we're going to continue with that Lend-Lease next time, and some things that were uncovered, things that Averell Harriman, just Robert Sherwood's book, Roosevelt and Hopkins, which I have, excuse me, and just make some discussion. Just very interesting stuff. Hope you'll dig into this and follow along with me. But we'll stop for now. Don't want to go too far or make this too long. All right. Thank you. Just my thoughts on the Cold War, things I'm learning, sharing with you. Not scholarly. I understand you disagree, think I'm all way off base. Tell me about it. That's okay. But this is just stuff that I'm learning and I want to share with you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.